Well, welcome everybody. It's really, really great to see you on the call tonight, and a special welcome to our speakers, Lisa Davies and Amanda Mackenzie. We're really looking forward to hearing from you both tonight. And it's also wonderful to see so many of our group members on the call as well, and it's great to see all of you as well. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the countries across Australia on which we're meeting today, recognising their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and also to pay my respects to elders past, present and elders of the future. Tonight, our topic is changing the climate news cycle, which I don't know about you, but I'm really looking forward to. I'm so interested in this. We've got two terrific speakers, Lisa Davies, who's the CEO of Australian Associated Press, and Amanda Mackenzie, who is the CEO and founder of the Climate Council. Just a couple of words about the format before we get going. We're going to first hear from Lisa, and then we'll go straight on and hear from Amanda. And then after that, we'll open it up for Q&A. And if you've got any questions as we go, please, as always, feel free to add them to the chat, or you can hold on till later and we can come to your questions later on as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lisa Davies. Lisa's the CEO of AAP and has been since February 2022. AAP is Australia's national news agency and content partner. It provides editorial to the Australian and international media and corporate sectors and has done so for more than 85 years. Prior to AAP, Lisa spent almost 10 years at the Sydney Morning Herald and the last 4 as the editor. And before that, she was the chief court reporter at the Daily Telegraph, and she started her career as a journalist back at AAP. So how fitting. Welcome, Lisa. It's great to have you with us, and we're really looking forward to hearing a little more. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn and Stephen, for inviting me along today. And hi, everyone. I hope I can be interesting enough to keep you all awake on a rainy Monday night. But I'll do my best. As Carolyn said, please feel free to put a question in the chat or interrupt me by waving furiously if you want to ask anything as I go along. But yeah, hopefully I can provide you a bit of context about this topic and also a little bit about AAP, which is a really important piece of national infrastructure, I would suggest. And thankfully, the government has sought fit to agree with that, and most recently gave us some funding in the federal budget back in May. So I'll just explain a little bit about how AAP works. Have any of you heard of AAP? Maybe just give me a wave. Yeah, okay, good. All right. So for those who haven't, it is, as Carolyn said, Australia's national newswire, news agency. There are many of them around the world. Most countries have one. You might have heard of AP, Associated Press in America. Reuters is probably the most well-known. Agence France-Presse, the French Press Association in London. I could go on. There's loads of them. And Australian Associated Press is the Australian version. So we were established in 1934 by Sir Keith Murdoch, actually. And AAP for most of its life was co-owned by, I'll just give you a quick potted history, was co-owned by both the Murdoch House, the House of Murdoch, and also the Fairfax Press. So they were the majority shareholders, established to kind of provide baseline services to reduce the cost across a wide range of publications, and also to be the conduit for international content coming into the country. So that hence sort of newswire, like it literally sort of used to go down the wire, so to speak. It worked pretty well for a pretty long time. And then at the start of 2020, just as we were about to enter a global pandemic, our former overlords, News and Fairfax, decided that they no longer wished to be the majority shareholders of the business, and sought to withdraw that agreement, tear up that agreement, effectively rendering the newswire obsolete. Like we couldn't have survived without them under that structure, because they also, whilst also receiving the content and paying for it, paid a large amount of membership fees as well. I must admit, I was editor of the Herald at the time when that happened, and I could definitely at that point understand the reasons why those two organisations pulled out. Effectively, as the argument went, they were subsidising their competitors. So organisations, smaller organisations, weren't paying as much for their subscription fees, and they were, effectively paying to keep this organisation alive. Anyway, thankfully, a group of philanthropists got their heads together and bought the company for $1, restructured it as a not-for-profit, and here we are. Basically, it's been a pretty rocky first 3 years. We just had Friday a week ago was 3 years to the day since AAP 2.0 was officially begun. Where it's an interesting business. We have a commercial business, so we still retain almost all of Australia's media as clients, except for News Corp. They elected instead to set up their own, which is fun. It only serves its own audience. They do have a couple of external clients, but predominantly we are the newswire of choice, and we reach over 450 news outlets around the country. So and I'd say 300 of those 450 are in rural and regional Australia. We provide the national and state news stories for those smaller organisations, so that they can focus on local content, so they can deliver. We don't seek to get involved. They're the specialists in their area, and we don't interfere with that. And then they take the federal. They can't afford to have a reporter in Canberra or covering the Great Barrier Reef or things like that. So that's how generally we find our clients like to work. We also, and I think this is, this will probably get more to the point of this session today, which is, we also, as part of our new structure as a not-for-profit charity, we do have DGR status. We have created a bunch of what we call specialist desks. So we had a goal in the first year to have 3. We ended up with 6. There's a lot of support in philanthropic circles for different kinds of content, and perhaps arguably content that doesn't get as much effort, doesn't have as much focus in the national press. Certainly not enough factual coverage. So I guess the crucial thing to say about AAP is we do no opinion. We are entirely without masters, objective, factual, unbiased, all the words that used to be synonymous with all kinds of journalism, but I know from feedback that I've had around the place that certainly isn't always the case anymore. So we really pride ourselves on that. I think it's we're pretty well respected in the industry for being the source of truth. It's often said that nothing happens unless AAP publishes it. So we definitely don't sort of run off and publish something because we think it's happened. We wait until it has. So and we have 2 sources to confirm it. So it's certainly a responsibility we take incredibly seriously, and I think it's a reputational issue that we really focus on a lot. So just to our sort of philanthropic desks and the way we have structured sort of content, which I think is most interesting to you guys on the call today. These are many areas that, as I said, don't often get a lot of focus in the mainstream media or in any media really, and not certainly in a factual and fair way. So we currently have 8 philanthropic desks, and I'll talk a little bit in a minute about how some of them are deliberately very collaborative and work together. But across the board, we have Indigenous Affairs Desk, which of course in this particular year is hugely important, and they're cranking out the stories at 1 million miles an hour, as you can imagine. Refugee Desk, I don't think, well, certainly not at the organisation I used to work at. There was no full-time refugee reporter or immigration reporter, but so we do have one of those, and in fact we have 2 people, including someone with lived experience of forced migration, working on our refugee desk, and we're doing quite a lot of work in encouraging young refugees who might have been trained as journalists elsewhere but don't have the skills to sort of work here. We're trying to create a bit of a pipeline and some training for them through that desk as well, which is great. We've got an arts desk, which is incredibly busy, and we have across a range of other topics: environment, future economies, green transport, agriculture, rural and regional, and I think I've forgotten one, but it'll come back to me, I'm sure. What I think is sort of most, I would say, interesting for this group is that we really have tried, and quite deliberately so, created this stable of desks that look at Australia's most pressing issues from a wide range of perspectives. So we do quite rich reporting. So these specialist reporters are very focused on yes, they do the main news when it's happening in their areas, but they also are allowed the freedom to work on things a bit more deeply, to talk to a wide range of researchers and add that level of consideration, and at which therefore in turn sort of creates a more comprehensive layer of coverage over the top. So, I think, for example, we have, if you think about environment, future economies, so the transition economy, transport, in particular green transport, agriculture and rural and regional reporters, those guys work really close together and really focus quite a lot on making sure that we're covering sometimes, the same story or the same issue from quite a range of perspectives. So, really focusing on, okay, what is this issue? What does it mean? I suppose you take the example of the green energy transition. Everyone knows what it means broadly, but let's dig into it. What does that look like when you unravel it outside of the daily news cycle, pick it apart? What does it require of governments, business leaders, banks, supply chains? Where's that economy piece coming in? What does it mean for farmers? Our agriculture reporter is talking a lot around regenerative farming and agriculture. How the environment suffer, what are the species that are under impact, and how are things looking for? I mentioned the Great Barrier Reef earlier, those sorts of issues, and how do we move around? How do these sort of the transition, how's it going to change the way we move? I mean, I see more Teslas on the road between here and Jarvis Bay than I think I've seen anywhere in the last 6 months. Everyone's looking to buy electric cars. It's fantastic. And so, what are the risks and opportunities in regional Australia? How are people being better connected? Are they worse off? So these sorts of things are how we're sort of tackling this idea of breaking the news cycle, and changing it for the better. Because I personally, there's no way I could possibly have any evidence to support this, but AAP injecting an additional 500 stories per year of factual, fair, balanced reporting on a subject like, the green energy transition, that in the lead up to that last election will definitely have educated people in areas that cannot possibly be reached by the politicians. They can't possibly be reached in their local communities in ways that, we would like to think. So we're really proud of that work, and we're really proud of the way that, it's been received. We are constantly looking at ways we can add to our list of supporters, and not just supporters, but the desks that we're looking at. I think environment is something, that now Australia is on board with, we had to drag the politicians there kicking and screaming, but as a nation, I think we've really moved forward. And I think all of this sort of reporting that becomes incredibly, and our content is used all over the place. Like, it's not just in regional newspapers. The Fairfax Press, now the nine facts, as I call it, the 9 publishing mastheads, the AFR, everyone's able to use our content. It gets read on radio, websites all over the country. Millions and millions of Australians now are getting that sort of specialized content and deeper, more explanatory journalism. So to me, it's a hugely vital role, and I'm very proud of the work that we're doing in it, and there's heaps more to do. We're certainly not slowing down yet. So I guess that's the main part of what I wanted to talk about to the topic. So jump in and ask any questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. That's fabulous and really sets off the evening really well. So thank you so much. And I think what we'll do is I'll bring in Amanda now, and then we'll go to questions to the group after that we can steer to both of you. So thanks so much. Really great, Lisa. So I'd now like to introduce Amanda Mackenzie. Amanda is the CEO and founder of the Climate Council. She's been in this role since its inception in 2013. And the crowdfunding that really got them started right back then. The Climate Council is Australia's own independent, evidence-based organisation on climate science, the impacts and the solutions. And what they do is they connect decision makers, the public and the media to drive action at a scale, to elevate climate stories in the news, and to shape the conversation on climate consequences and action both at home and abroad. The Climate Council also advocates for climate policies and solutions that can rapidly drive down emissions. And all this is done in partnership with the community of thousands of people that they have supporting them. So welcome, Amanda, and over to you to talk a little bit again about really the changing the climate news cycle as you see it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm meeting you as well. I'm on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging too. I thought I'd go through 4 different related points, I suppose, just starting with the nature of the climate challenge, give you a bit of a background on the Climate Council story, which is fundamentally one about tackling this wicked communication challenge. Then talk about a bit of a narrative framework in terms of how we think that you can change the public narrative, and then talk about a case study. So climate change is a wicked problem that's been used. I think Al Gore used that phrase first. And it's true on so many levels when you think about the complexity of the science, all of the multidimensional ways in which we can assess the climate challenge, from looking at ice cores to looking at every different component of the Earth, basically, to assess how the planet is being impacted. Then you go to the solutions, the scale and speed of the change that's required, all of the different technologies that come into play, and the scale of the economic transformation. And then the communications in and of itself. So just communicating, particularly sort of 10 years ago, when the extreme weather that we were experiencing, people were certainly not drawing the dots, and it wasn't as extreme as what we're seeing now. Saying this colourless, odourless gas that we use in so many different ways in our life is causing this catastrophic change that will gradually occur into the future, and that this is something that we should all prioritise, is immensely challenging, helping people to join those dots as to what the catastrophe could mean for them. And also talking about it at a global scale, which inherently can make people feel very small and like they have no agency. But of course, it was also a highly contested issue, and remains highly contested in terms of, we've won many of the fights now. We won, is climate change an issue at all? Yes, it is. Well, it's not that important. Now, globally, it is increasingly viewed with substantial importance. But how quickly should we deal with it? In what way should we deal with it? All of those questions still remain contested. And so you put all of that in the bucket, and the communications challenge becomes really very challenging, particularly because some of the opposition, of course, was from very powerful people, very powerful industries, many of whom have strong links into the media or media agencies that have been incredibly hostile to climate action. I came to climate communications having started an organisation called the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, which was all about getting young people engaged in climate change, which I started when I was at university. But as the issue sort of went on and I really got to know it, we came to that era of sort of 2011 to 2014, when the issue was at its lowest. We'd had a 10-year drought, which had made people really understand drought and climate are linked. Then it rained for 2 years with the La Nina. And that commentary on it's raining, therefore climate change isn't happening, was actually quite potent. And the issue in terms of people's level of concern in the public really plummeted. We also then had a toxic carbon tax debate after having the kind of schmozzle of the CPRS debate a few years earlier. So for me, I wanted to get really involved in climate communications. I strategically decided that If we couldn't get the communications right and we couldn't get our community on the same page backing significant change, we were never going to get the politics right, and therefore the economics and all of the level of change that was required across society. So I went to work at the Climate Commission, which was all about communicating climate science. And apparently it did its job too well, because the first act of the Abbott government was to abolish the Climate Commission. Fortunately, we had seen this coming and had sort of a back pocket idea, which was, how about if we did this as a public entity? So the Climate Council was born from that, like a phoenix from the ashes, but we didn't have any funding. We had to go to the public. And so Tim Flannery, who's the Chief Commissioner at the time, and I put together this plan. And 4 days after we were abolished, we went out to the public saying, will you support this? And we were absolutely floored by the response. So this is a few weeks after the election, and there was a lot of people that were really upset in terms of the Abbott government's denial around climate change. But also the Climate Commission had focused so much on evidence-based communication around climate science. And I think we probably collectively in this room really appreciate that our democracy is only as strong as having that accurate basis of information that is a shared idea of what evidence is. So the public really got behind it. We had 15,000 people give within a week, and we raised $1.3 million that put the Climate Council in business. So our job since that time has really been to put together accurate evidence-based information based on firstly the science, but increasingly the economics, the solutions, a whole range of other things, and then communicate it, not simplistically, but simply to the Australian public. And that communications piece is what I really want to focus on today. And over that time in my career over the last 10 years at the Climate Council and the Commission before, my theory in terms of how do you change public understanding on a contentious issue involves 3 strategies. The first is to get a really strong, clear message. And a message is often thought of as a sort of PR term. But what I mean by that is you have a framework or a basis of evidence for what you want to say. You then interpret that again to make it simple and clear, but it's not simplistic. You're still communicating the depth of the challenges and the science, but you're doing it in a way that's relevant for your audience and can help them understand it. A lot of climate science and climate information has often gone way over people's heads because it's too much complexity, too many graphs, all of that sort of stuff. So we were really about how do we make clear information, and then thinking about each of the audiences that we wanted to change their opinion, and starting with where are they at, who do they need to hear from, which communications vehicles, which media, which social media, etc., are they going to be connected with. So crafting messages that were going to resonate with each of the different communities we were trying to persuade. The second part of the narrative changing framework is the messenger. So at that time in sort of 2013, most of the people that were commentating on climate were either politicians, they were scientists, or they were policy wonks. So the issue wasn't really resonating with the general public around this is something that I should care about. This is something that elite audiences are interested in discussing, and it is highly contentious. So I'll wait until it's resolved is basically where people get to. So what we wanted to do is bring out a whole range of different voices that could cut through and make this issue something that was for the kitchen table. This is about my community. It's not about polar bears. It's about what does it mean for Australians that are going to be experiencing extreme weather. This is about the solar installer down the road that could really benefit from the new industries. This is about the farmer that could lose their crop. This is about all of us and how we live together. This is about the future of our country. So we did, that's the second step, and I'll talk more about who and how we found those people in the case study I use. And then the third point of this framework is really about volume and frequency of communications. I like to think about it as surround sound. If you want to change someone's mind, they have to think the issue is important. It's got to be, relative to all of the other stuff that's going on for them. It has to be rising to the top. That means they have to hear about it all the time. And then they've got to hear about it from people that they're persuaded by, that they connect with, etc. So we needed to have enough information going out there all the time that was going to pique media interest and content across sort of social media channels, etc., that people were going to experience a surround sound. And I sort of cut up our audience in different ways over time, depending on who we wanted to influence. But the top line over the years has been an elite audience, which we mean as politicians and senior journalists and things like that, who we are really trying to get that surround sound bubble, because they are the people that set the national agenda. And then we've also had other groups in the community who, when we do the public opinion research, we're finding that those groups are going to be particularly influential. So for instance, prior to the last election, one of the key groups that were going to be influential was people that were sort of small L liberals in Conservative seats that tended to vote, were open to voting for the Teals. That was, how do we tell a positive climate change story in those electorates, for instance, was how we targeted an audience. So that's a narrative changing framework: message, messenger, volume, and frequency. So one example of how we've done that, and across the climate issue, we spend a lot of time really casting ahead, thinking about how we would change the story. So the common sense proposition, I like to put it, the Overton window is something that's often used, which is, if this is the window, this is what we want the conversation to be, this is what the opposition wants it to be. We want it always moving it in our direction, so opening space. And if you think back to 2013, when we put out our first report as a Climate Council, which was about bushfires and climate change, the Prime Minister of the day, Tony Abbott, said in reference to our report, this is bullshit, you know, climate change isn't happening right now. And he also referenced the Blue Mountain fires, which we had said, you know, this is climate change, by saying, how can you can't link any extreme weather event to climate change. So we have moved a lot from that stage. And I'll tell you some of the strategies that we've used, and many others have been part of this as well. So in terms of the message, again, we put out a whole range of different evidence, lots of reports on fires, floods, heat waves, droughts, and lots of content looking at it from the insurance perspective, looking at it for the farming perspective, looking at it from a whole range of different perspectives. And over time, I think we've put out about 25 reports on bushfires, for instance. What does it mean for the ACT, for Victoria, for the nation? Lots of different angles telling the exact same story in different ways and with clear, crisp messages. So heat waves, for instance, back when we wrote our first report on heat waves, scientists that were reporting on heat waves often, and this is true of every different extreme weather event, would often start with the caveats. Scientists often put their content out of what they don't know before what they do know. And journalists are looking at, what do you know? So we sat down with a whole bunch of scientists. What do we know on heat waves? And we concluded we know they're getting hotter, longer, they're happening more often. Okay, that's something that we can, you know, put out there and get good coverage on. So our first heatwave report was called Hotter, Longer, More Often. I must have said that phrase now thousands of times, and same with all of our spokespeople, because we're trying to get that clear message across. And for each of the different extreme weather events, for all of the solutions, every different piece of content or idea that we have that we want to communicate, we try and distill it into something really simple, but is communicating a bigger idea. So that's extreme weather. There's lots of those phrases around the message. The messenger has been a really big piece. The first piece was just having shared information for other communicators. There's lots of people communicating on climate, from journalists to scientists to people at not-for-profit organizations and many others. So we saw our reports as synthesizing the scientific research and then putting our communications lens on it, putting the key findings up the top that were really simple, that could essentially be cut and paste into a press release and then into a journalist's article, that were then going to be really accessible for anyone that was having to communicate on climate change and needed some depth in whichever area we were going into. So we've written about 130 reports now that cover a lot of content. The second piece was, as I said earlier, there was only a few different types of people that could communicate. So we established something called the Climate Media Centre, which is all about identifying, training, and then pitching to media a whole range of different spokespeople that really humanise and change the nature of how we think about this issue. So doctors, for instance, recently they've been talking about gas and health, for instance, supporting traditional owners running legal cases against fossil fuel projects in Narrabri or the Tiwi Islands or other places, supporting farmers who wanted to tell a story on the land about how climate change was impacting their property, which when we first started working with farmers in 2015 was very challenging, because many farmers really didn't want to put their head above the parapet in their community. So the strategy with them was much more soft, for instance, than some of the other spokespeople that we've worked with. We've worked with economists, worked with people across lots of different technologies, from solar, wind, etc. Lots of athletes, sport personalities, Pat Cummins to the AFL players, a whole different raft of people. We've trained over 5,000 people, and then we have put together a sort of list of the most, the strongest communicators that then we are pitching to media all the time. So CMC generates about 20,000 articles a year, which doesn't have any identity to the Climate Council. This is all about those spokespeople having their voices heard, but then goes to the last strategy, which is how do you get that volume? So an additional 20,000 articles that certainly the Climate Council couldn't get with the same set of spokespeople over and over. You need a diversity, and you need lots of different interesting stories to make it real. The other piece on Messenger, is working with emergency leaders. So you might have seen Greg Mullins, who's a former fire chief in New South Wales. We've worked with fire chiefs right around Australia to put together a particular group who is able to authoritatively talk about extreme weather events. It's very hard for a government official to go up against a fire chief when the fire chiefs are saying this is climate change. That was critical during Black Summer. The fire chiefs warned in advance that Black Summer was going to be very bad. Unfortunately, it wasn't listened to. A range of their recommendations around aircraft and other things were not heeded until very, very late in the game in January, when the fires were obviously had catastrophic impact already. And I'll come back to Black Summer just in a moment. So you can see with a range of these different strategies with messengers, I've mentioned already the CMC having 20,000 articles. That's a lot of volume. Putting out lots of reports is, again, more volume. So we tend to gear our reports and our work in lots of different ways that are really relevant for media audiences across the whole range of media, from traditional media to our social media content as well. And we can get into more of those strategies, if you like, in the Q&A. But just coming back, that's sort of a potted history of that work over 10 years, which has been very deliberate around changing the narrative from this is not, climate change, it's happening some stage down the future, if it's happening at all, to this is happening right now, it's all around us, it's in our locality, and every extreme weather event that happens, we come out when we see that the clear links to climate change and articulate that. And from being criticised 10 years ago by Tony Abbott saying you can't even say that, not it's wrong, just you can't even say that and it's wrong, to now after Black Summer, Scott Morrison had to admit that this was influenced by climate change. And now I think it's very hard for any politician to deny that climate change is influencing these extreme weather events. So narrative change does take time, particularly when you're in a hostile media environment. But I think these strategies are sort of tried and true and work not just on like this narrow set of issues around extreme weather, but also across the range of other things that we need to communicate on climate. So I might leave it there, Stephen and Caroline, and pass back to you.
Thank you so much. So interesting as well. I'm happy to hear more about what's gone on behind the scenes. I'm going to encourage anyone in the group who's got a question to start thinking about it and perhaps add it to the chat. But I was just going to kick off with one question to you both. I know perhaps it's been a little bit better in recent times, but there's been quite a lot of comment about how climate issues aren't, a lot of extreme weather and quite obvious climate impacts aren't necessarily covered in the news or haven't been covered as much as what perhaps factually you could say there is a link. What do you see and how do you encourage greater uptake and coverage of climate issues? Perhaps if we go to you, Lisa, first and then to Amanda.
So it's an interesting question, actually. So I think one of the things I've noticed in reporting of extreme weather events, particularly in the last few years, is that we've definitely, I think, started to reference the climate impacts amongst the reporting. So and make that direct link through the interviewing of different types of experts, perhaps, or meteorologists, etc., also weighing in. So rather than just saying, we're having a insane hot period, whatever the major extreme weather event is. I mean, I know during the bushfires, the Herald was the first to really call it out. The first major news organisation we put it on the front page when the then New South Wales Environment Minister Matt Keane made the link and was the first politician to just say that in 2019 the bushfires were the result of climate change. And I think that and in the lead up to that was the fire chiefs who had written to the government. And Greg Mullins had come out and written an op-ed for us that really highlighted that from their perspective, the intent. So just constantly linking it, I think, has really probably enabled people to make that sort of the theoretical into the practical, if you know what I'm saying. So people who might otherwise just go, oh, it's hot today, or it's cold today, or whatever, there's a bushfire out west somewhere, they're actually being, the information is being put before them in a way that is, because people read weather stories. I can just give you the hot tip. People read weather stories like nothing else. People love, so certainly Sydney Morning Herald readers love reading about the weather. It was sort of quite ridiculous, actually. So to be able to constantly reinforce that was a really in the way of our reporting was really helpful, I think, because it meant people were not just getting the whys and wherefores of the actual event, but also the science behind it and what was possibly happening. So in terms of encouraging, if that's the word you use, Carolyn, yeah, I think that definitely probably helped.
Thanks, Lisa. That's really interesting. Amanda, have you got a different perspective or something to add there?
Yeah, just add something. The difference between Black Saturday and how it was communicated in the media versus Black Summer was vastly different, with 10 years difference. In Black Saturday, less than 5% of articles would have mentioned climate change, but by the time we got to Black Summer, it was more like 45% of articles mentioned climate change. So it was a really big step change. And I think one thing that stands out, though, is that Australian media mentions climate change a whole lot more than most other countries, because there are people here that are deliberately making that link every time the extreme weather events happen. In other places where climate has not been as contentious, interestingly, like in many of the European countries, there's not as much discussion about climate change. In the US and Canada, it's very limited. And that's partly because I think in the US and Canada, they're both kind of where we were some years ago, when it's still difficult to talk about it. I think the Hawaiian experience most recently is the most, I haven't seen stats on it yet, but it's the most I've seen the US media talk about climate change. So it's interesting, like our perception certainly is it's not enough. And it's also how it's covered during heat waves. Even if they write a climate change article, they always put girls in bikinis in the photographs. So you got that double message of, oh, it's fun, we're all having a great time at the beach, versus killer heat wave. So we've been having that conversation with media kind of fruitlessly for some time.
Good stuff. Well, thanks so much, Amanda. Lots of questions coming in now, so I'll just sort of fire some away. And thanks, Lisa, for putting in some of those examples of some of the articles.
Yeah, sorry, I meant to do it as I finished. I just hadn't in the right spot.
Yeah, it was interesting, Amanda, just hearing what you've said. So Karen and I have just come back from the UK, and we were there when all this heat wave stuff was going on in places like Rhodes and and interestingly, looking at the UK media, they were linking it to climate change as well, which was good to see. Now, Mono's asked this question. I won't go through it all because it's quite long, but it relates to basically businesses and on insurance and reinsurance and boards, and just, I suppose, the impacts that climate impacts adversely affecting these business models, and how can climate communicators use insurance and reinsurance companies to maximize impact and influence the lawmakers? Hopefully I've summarized that one well, Mono. Amanda, do you want to chat to that one a bit?
Yeah, I can start that. Yeah, it's a very valuable strategy. I think it puts dollars around the cost of failing to tackle climate change, whereas it has often been very difficult to quantify exactly the scale of the cost of failing to act versus it's been easier to quantify the costs of acting. So we've done quite a bit of work in this space. We worked with Choice just last week, actually. I'll put it in the chat, a report on exactly this. And we found our report that we put out, I think it might have been the start of last year. It was called Compounding Cost, and it was looking at the insurance across Australia from a number of different extreme weather events. And we could put it down to electorates and suburbs. And we found that was one of our most picked up reports in a number of years. It kind of combines weather and housing, which Australians are very interested in, both topics, and their house prices and cost of living, all of that kind of comes into it. So I think that story is extremely interesting for people.
Thank you. We might now go to you, Lisa, for the next question. Luke's asked, do you have an obligation to give equal space and time to both sides of an issue, even if one side's not really supported by as strong a science or evidence?
It's a really good question, Luke. Thank you. No is the short answer. I think there's a real debate. Well, you know, I have to go back a step. It was a long time ago that the Sydney Morning Herald first said they were not going to report or quote any climate deniers in the publication anymore. There was to be no, that the Herald as a masthead accepted the science, and, we were moving on from the ridiculous debate. That was back in about 2012, I think, or 13. So that has been the case there for quite some time. And obviously most other reputable news organizations do the same. I think the idea of giving equal space to contested points of science is, of more minor issues is a reasonable one. I definitely don't think there's a problem with false equivalence, I suppose. If you end up putting exactly the same amount of less robust research or less, tested theories up against something that is much more widely accepted, then you are creating a sense of contest when there really isn't one. So I think it is a real challenge, and has become a real challenge for some people more than others. I think we really try to, in our reporting, at least at AAP, focus entirely on what is factual, accepted, peer-reviewed, really concentrate on the things that can be held out as true and factual, and not give any credence to the more experimental or wishy-washy theories and ideas that are still in their infancy. So I think, does that answer your question, Luke? I'm not actually sure where you are. Yeah. But yeah, no, it is a bit of a challenge at times on certain issues, but more broadly, I think, no, there shouldn't really need to be that equal space and time to both sides, if it's reasonably cut and dry.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Amanda, I'll ask you this one. So this is from Graham. He says, how do you tackle misinformation? I.e., do you tackle it head on? Do you ignore it, or do you try and sort of flood the zone with better, more compelling, grounded stories?
Yeah, those are basically the tactics. I think it depends who it is and how they're putting the information. Previously, some years ago, when climate denial was so strong, we would really look at the news, any particular issue. So if Andrew Bolt said something, it would percolate in, his audience, and then it might go to Sky News, it might get a run in the Australian. But when it went from being there to then being mainstream news, being picked up by an AAP or a Sydney Morning Herald or whatever, that's when it became a big problem. It started to become a mainstream narrative. So we would always try and stop it from going from an Andrew Bolt to the next level by briefing journalists about the correct information and sort of inoculating people against whatever information was coming out. But now it's less about sort of denial around the science, and there's a range of other issues, like it might be particular. There's still an issue around what is the level of cost in the transition, and a whole range of different economic challenges now around how we do the transition rather than the climate science itself, but it's still using those sorts of tactics. Like in general, you don't want to give misinformation oxygen, but if it's flowing through into something that's going to get bigger and it's going to start influencing a broader group of people, you might need to do some work to inoculate against that getting much stronger.
That's interesting. So is it sort of moving from, the climate skeptic media moving from sort of denial to more sort of delay, and that sort of, as you said, the cost of things? And
yeah, well, it's interesting. Like we've had a lot published in the Daily Telegraph, the Australian in the last 2 years that has been straight up decent articles on climate change, which has been a big shift in their editorial in the last few years. But there still is a huge amount of support in those publications for coal and gas projects. And I think that's where there's a whole range of different myths in that area around the solutions and what does it take to transition our economy. So yeah, there's a huge range of list of myths that you're sort of looking out for, and some of them can be quite persuasive and damaging.
Yeah.
And can I just quickly say, just to add to that, AAP does quite a lot. We have a whole business sort of unit called AAP Fact Check. So in terms of misinformation, we are working really hard to debunk a lot of the and disinformation, so the deliberate misinformation that is out there across a range of issues. It's a reasonably small team, but it's something that we're highlighting a lot at the moment around the Voice to Parliament. There's a lot of it, and we're being funded by actually a couple of the tech platforms to do more of it. And it's been, it's been prevalent in the climate space as well. The politicians don't like it terribly much, but yeah, it's a really worthwhile service, and you can find it on aap.com.au/fact check if you want to check out some of the articles that we've published.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Lisa. That's so important
Mm.
and great to know about. Jill's asked, does AAP have a relationship with Reuters, and how has becoming a not-for-profit affected your reporting?
That's a great question. Thanks, Jill. So yes, we still have a relationship with Reuters, not in a business sense. We don't have a as in we're not a joint entity or anything like that, but we do share content. Reuters is still kind of the dominant global news wire, I would say, and they have resources that I can only dream about. As for becoming not-for-profit, I think the major advantage has given us, I think in a couple of fronts. One is that, like I personally have said since the beginning, it's probably the best thing that ever happened to AAP to not be owned by its competitors anymore. It has hopefully freed up the reporters to not just feel like you're the backup reporter for the journalist at the Herald or wherever else. You're standing on your own 2 feet, and your stories are getting the merit they deserve. But also the beauty of being a not-for-profit has allowed us to really open the door to philanthropy and to do things that our former shareholders probably wouldn't have really thought was worthwhile. Not that they might have had a direct involvement in the content side, but they would have certainly, as a board, had a view on some of the reporting that we're doing. I think we're really trying to position the organisation as a progressive one, that we're doing things to support the industry, where we're putting every dollar that we make back into the journalism. So I think those are the key sort of tenets of what we're sort of about with the not-for-profit parties. I mean, we're definitely not making loads of money, that's for sure, but we're doing our best to stay afloat, and whatever we do make goes back into making the business better and to supporting the industry better as well. Because so many of those publications that subscribe to us, if we didn't exist, I don't think they would really be able to as well.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lisa. Amanda, I might ask you this one. It's really interesting. This is from Sue. She says, there seems to be a difference between TV, press, and social media. Any tips on how to influence the different media?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think each medium has a set of different needs. So it's really about putting yourselves in the shoes of, if it's a media outlet, what is the producer or what does the journalist need? So if it's Sunrise, for instance, which is one of the more difficult TV shows to get on, but it has a more quite a general audience, and often a group that you want to influence. For instance, you've got to think, well, what does a TV producer want? They want things, they need color, they need movement, they need a cuddly animal might be good. They need people that are really interesting, but are going to speak to, a mum who's preparing the breakfast for kids or something like that. That's not going to be 100% focused on the TV. So you don't want to be there with, a really wonky scientist just talking numbers, for instance. They're never going to pick that up. But if you can get, say, we've put vets on Sunrise, for instance, with a koala talking about the impact of the bushfires, blah, 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 like that might be something that you can get through. So it's really thinking about that. Social media is the same. You think about like an Instagram audience, people scrolling it, usually looking for content that is just fun and entertaining. So can you make your content fun and entertaining about whatever it is you're talking about? And once you've caught their eyeballs, can you give them whatever the information is that you're trying to give them? So it's in many ways a communications landscape, because it's so broad and you're competing so hard for influence. You have to be much more creative and interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Lisa, any comments on that as well?
No, I agree.
Great. We've got another question here from Phil. What is the best way to communicate the transition arrangements required to get to final carbon neutral outcomes? How do you deal with cost of living arguments of the fossil fuel interests? And how do we deal simply with the arguments around nuclear energy?
Well, I can jump in if you want. The arguments about nuclear are relatively easy in the sense that to build any nuclear power in Australia would be extremely costly, would take a long time, and would never be funded by commercial enterprises because, again, of the costs and the time, and that they'll be outcompeted by solar and wind and batteries and other things. So the idea that you'd put public money into something that private investors would totally turn their nose up at is crazy, particularly when you layer over that the challenges around social license. Like you see the social license of coal, oil and gas just evaporating. It's not as if nuclear is having a resurgence in social license. I just laugh thinking about the Nationals and the Liberals saying, oh, yeah, we want nuclear and I'd be happy to have it in my electorate. Well, I bet the voters aren't happy to have it in their electorate. So I don't think they'll stick with that for that long. So nuclear, extremely unlikely in an Australian scenario. So I just usually argue it on the economics. In terms of the other solutions and then the cost of living argument, because solar is now the cheapest form of power in Australia, there is a clear argument there around where do we get our energy from. I think the challenge is that there's not a deep understanding about, gas prices, for instance, that our gas prices are linked to the global market now, that there is a range of reasons why gas will increase in price. And there's a lot of myths floating around. So just telling that story over and over that renewables are now the cheapest source of new power and we need more renewables, and that will make our energy more secure long term and will allow prices to be cheaper and cheaper, and showing the examples of that is powerful. But again, like the contested space around extreme weather or other things, it's when you're in competition, it's obviously harder to win. But I think that it's been interesting on the gas front around the cost of living. I think people have really seen that through this winter, gas prices going up and the consequences, and there's a lot of interest in looking at electricity for their sources of power, and lots of interest in solar panels, etc.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Now I'm going to direct this one at you, Lisa. This question was always going to come up in this session, and here it is. So this is from Jessica. She says, what do you think are some of the main challenges for Australia, given the really high concentration of the Murdoch press here?
So my slight contrary, to slightly change the starting point for your question, Jess, is a good one. I actually don't think the Murdoch press has as much power as they think they do. And I think you only have to look at the most recent Victorian election, as well as the federal election, and the huge wave of support for the Teals that exists that existed at the last election, to think that their daily hammering of every issue that led to those election results be entirely dismissed really by a massive swathe of the electorate. I think one of the challenges the rest of us have is to just tune it out. Of course, there are big pockets of support, and the Australian, for example, does a lot of great reporting on a lot of issues. Others they do not, in my view. But everyone's different, and I think they have done. I think Amanda even said before, like there are examples of very straight factual news stories that are supportive of, or not supportive of, like explaining climate change and progressive issues without the negative drumbeat that goes along behind. So I think that in terms of the challenge, I think media is fragmenting massively. I think you only have to look at our teenagers and 20-somethings who have never picked up a newspaper. They wouldn't know what a lot of the within mainstream press is. They get their news from TikTok. They get their news from, I think Instagram's not even that cool anymore, Snapchat, or wherever the new place is. They're getting information from there. I recently was speaking to a couple of friends of mine who started an online youth publication called The Daily Oz. It's going really well. It's based around Instagram and newsletters, and it's really factual, great reporting, but they're explaining stuff because, as they said, their audience are young sort of 20-somethings who don't know what a double dissolution election is, couldn't explain to you why they have to vote next week, or next month or a couple of months on a referendum. They just don't know any of this stuff because they're not engaged. They're not engaged with there are pockets that are incredibly engaged on certain issues, but if we're going to educate a lot more people, we have to do it outside of those massive news organizations. The same goes for Nine. I mean, it's not going to be long. I used to interview people for jobs at the Herald who came in saying, I grow up reading the Sydney Morning Herald on my parents' kitchen table. It doesn't happen anymore. I mean, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know a single family other than people that I know who work either in media comms or as journalists themselves, and their children don't read news. They don't read the paper. So I think in terms of the challenges that I would see, probably, Jess, they're more around making sure there are those sources. We have to meet, I think it's the biggest challenge for media proprietors anywhere, is meeting the audience where they are, not expecting them to come to us. And that's why every news outlet is trying to get their channels on TikTok and those things. And I mean, I don't think there are that many people looking at the Sydney Morning Herald on TikTok, but certainly not on AAP, but they're the kinds of things that we need to really attack quite heavily, because otherwise there just isn't a huge vacuum of actual news and information for younger people.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Interestingly, our 22-year-old daughter, she gets her news from the Daily Oz. So
it's fabulous. It's doing really well.
Yeah.
Really
Amanda, have you got any comments on that one, Amanda?
No, I think that's
covered
right. But I wouldn't say that one just caveat is, I don't think young people are necessarily different to previous generations, and I think it's true of all generations, is that most Australians are not heavily engaged in how our society is functioning and operating. Most people are not looking at the news in that way. Like, news is orientated primarily for entertainment. I think that goes to those weather stories. People are looking at weather because it's like interesting and these huge events and that sort of thing. Like, most people are not engaged and don't feel they have agency in a national conversation. So I think it's not necessarily that people are changing in a negative way, although I think social media does give people more of an out probably, and there's less homogenous views, but yeah.
Thanks, Amanda. Richard's asked, how do you create a good news narrative given much of the climate change story is a response to negative events? Do you want to have a go at that one, Amanda?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I talk specifically about extreme weather, but I should say that we try and orientate at least 60 to 70% of our content positively, particularly on all of our social channels. because it can be very doom and gloom and people can switch off. You want people to see that event and feel angry that the government didn't do enough and feel motivated to act, rather than I feel despairing and I want to put my head in the sand, or I want to just do my personal wellness and, you know, ignore the rest of the world and how I can contribute. So you want that to be catalytic, and you want the solutions piece to be inspiring and offer hope and a whole range of ways in which individuals can also join in and contribute. So we try and do a lot of technology stories about the new technologies that are out there that are interesting. We do a bunch of stuff on local governments, what's going on the ground that's, you know, tackling the problem. We do lots of taking international stories and trying to make them relevant here about progress that's happening. And when the government does, and all governments in Australia do good things, we try and make sure that we're out there celebrating. I think often there's a lot of, as soon as the government does something not great, there's lots of people lining up to tell them that, but often there's no one there to pat them on the back when they're doing good things. And that's true, particularly on social as well. So we try and create lots of opportunities and think about it as a virtuous circle. The more decision makers get patted on the back when they do something good, the more they'll probably want to do a little bit more of that. So the idea is to pat people on the back as much as possible when they're doing good things, even if it's not the biggest step forward that we would all hope for. Maybe it's something that is getting us in that direction.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And it's so motivating, isn't it? If you do hear like a really positive story, people got so much energy, for example, when the Teals were elected, it sort of gives you a boost of energy and enthusiasm. And
yeah, totally.
Did you find, Amanda, that so obviously the Labor, you know, people like Chris Bow, and politically, you know, I know you do a lot in Canberra. I mean, what sort of reception do you get from Labor, and what sort of reception are you getting from the Liberal side of politics?
Yeah. Well, I found Chris Bowen an incredibly constructive person to work with. I think he really gets the issue, and he's very committed to the agenda that he brought to the last election and getting it implemented. We'd argue that that agenda should be stronger and should then be strengthened in years to come. But I think he is, I think the Labor Party in general feels like they were burnt a number of times on the climate issue. And I think it's fair to say that they need to shed some of those scars if they're going to become bolder and braver going forward. So I think it's very important that they get some wins through on climate change, that the public pats them on the back, and then that they can genuinely shed some of those scars and hopefully become more ambitious to come. I fear that the coalition has not learnt the lessons of the Teal elections, and they haven't substantially changed their stance on climate change. During the last 10 years, we consistently would offer briefings from experts, from scientists to the extreme weather experts to former fire chiefs, etc. And it generally always fell on deaf ears. And that was always very challenging and very different at the state level, where we have a very good dialogue with the coalition partners, as well as the Labor parties in each of the different states. So I hold out hope that they will shift and learn the lesson from those smaller Liberal seats that the Teals have held, which I think there will probably be more challenges in other seats that are more, coalition heartland as well. So yeah, it shouldn't be a bipartisan issue, but it still is.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda.
Thank you. Quite a few people on the call probably know I'm really passionate about nature as well as climate, and obviously climate and nature are so intertwined. Have you got any comments about specific coverage in terms of nature? Because we do have some massive challenges, biodiversity, loss of our native forests, and just loss of nature, I suppose.
Yeah, I think I feel like nature is really underreported, and Australians would be devastated to truly understand the level of destruction that has occurred, particularly in my lifetime. I think back to I feel like my childhood through the 80s and 90s is like this idyllic period. When I look to taking my children, like 2 and 5, to different locations now, all of the places I grew up have been impacted in some way by biodiversity loss or climate change and other things. So And I think that nature goes to the what we all value as Australians and who we see ourselves as, our animals, our landscapes, who we are. So I think it needs more reporting. I would love to see a climate media centre for nature. I think a nature media centre to be getting those stories up, because I think there's a deep vein of concern and a deep vein of support that hasn't been sufficiently tapped, that could be if there was enough grounding. I know, Caroline, you probably in the nature conservation space know that it is obviously hard to get some of those stories up, but I feel like there's lots of opportunities with the government debating the environmental laws at the moment.
Thanks, Amanda. That's actually exciting to hear you say that, in that obviously we want it's not so exciting that it's not reported strongly, but that there is an opportunity and that you feel like there's an interest there.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a conversation to be continued.
Yeah, and I definitely think that it's something that we try to do as much as possible. It is hard among the news across the environment topic. As a reporter, Tracy Ferrier, who's our environment correspondent, she would far prefer writing about nature and species than the science of climate. It's just a balance for her, I think. So yeah, but the deforestation and all issues like that are hugely important.
Thank you. We've got one final question we wanted to ask before we wrap up, and that's looking to the next 12 months. What are you both most excited about? Maybe, Lisa, can we start with you and then we'll move to Amanda? We can come back to you if you'd like.
My goodness. Amanda?
Well, I just mentioned the environmental laws and how that will be a big point of debate. So this is called the EPBC Act and has been in place since John Howard days. And it needs to be fundamentally revisited. Like in 2023, our environmental laws don't take into account greenhouse gases, for instance, and there's a range of other deficiencies. So I'm excited about that fight. It will be tooth and nail. But if we can get a good outcome, it would make a monumental difference to preventing new coal and gas projects going ahead that will inevitably raise Australia's emissions substantially. So that would be a really good step.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
And this is more specific to my business than to the topics that we're talking about, although they do go hand in hand. The thing I'm most excited about is a positive response from the federal government about our funding come the end of the year. I think, without, as I said before, without us, the media diversity in this country is in peril, what limited diversity we have as it is. And, that will hopefully, we're really pushing hard to get a degree of medium term, if not long term funding, so that we can actually stabilise and hopefully grow the parts of our business that can and create some additional revenues so that we can be around for a really long time and continue the great reporting that we do. So yeah. I'm thinking positively and I'm excited about that this year.
Well, good luck with that, Lisa.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, just to wrap up tonight's session, I just want to say thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you so much, Amanda. It's been absolutely fabulous. So thank you to both. It's been highly engaging, lots of absolutely fabulous insights from both of you. So thank you both very much. And I hope to all of our group, I hope you found it useful and helped you understand more about the climate news cycle as well. So just looking forward over the next few months, we've got some fantastic sessions lined up next month. So September, the topic is going to be around sustainability in fashion and textiles. And we'll hear from Adrian Jones, and I can see Adrian there. So thanks, Adrian, who is the co-founder of a company called Blocktex. And they're a clean technology company that recovers polyester and cellulose from textiles and clothing. We're also going to hear from somebody from Big W, as well as also from Stephanie Devine, who's the founder and CEO of a company called The Very Good Bra, and they've created the world's first plastic-free bra. Also then in following months, we'll hear from Terry Butler, who was the Shadow Minister for the Environment and Water, and the federal member for Griffith up until the last federal election. And she now sits on various boards, including as president of the Smart Energy Council. So lots of good things coming up as well. And thanks again, Amanda and Lisa and everyone, and see you again soon.
Thanks for having
you, Caroline, for having us. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.